Didn't realize I had
I
one.
enjoy seeing them.
Yes. All right, sorry about that. Hi there, my name is Toby Farley. I'm the director of the Philmont Public Library, and we're here tonight with the Columbia County Libraries Association. My partner here, Michelle from the New Lebanon Library, is here as well. We welcome you to this webinar. We'll let you know that we will, if you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A box or the chat box, and we'll both be monitoring that. And at the end, we will pass those along to Paul, who's Paul Stewart here. He's from the Underground Railroad Education Center in Albany, and he's going to present our program tonight. And Paul, whenever you're ready.
All set. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Hello, everybody, and thank you for being here. I'm going to jump to my slides, and I want to begin by telling you a little bit about the Underground Railroad Education Center. If I can figure out, it's always a challenge to figure out your slides, I guess.
I'm sorry, excuse me, Paul, could I just 1 second? I have another person who's letting me know that we can definitely hear some background from you because you're the only one that has sound. So it sounds
Okay,
like we have a conversation in the background or something.
we're getting a little chatter in the background. I am in an open space, and there's some other things going on here, so I apologize. But it's amazing how well these things can pick up the sound, right? So when I spoke initially with you regarding what I was going to talk about, basically I alluded to the anti-slavery in Columbia County and the region in the years prior to the Civil War. So see if I could get my slides to cooperate here. Okay, there we go. So I want to start by talking about what I have been doing for the past 22 years. And that is my involvement with what we call the Underground Railroad Education Center now. Initially, we called it the Underground Railroad History Project. And that's a non-for-profit organization that's really was founded in 2003 or incorporated in 2003. And the goal was to re-explore and re-examine the story of the Underground Railroad. You know, in a lot of ways, I think people in general would take it for granted that they have a pretty good idea of what the Underground Railroad is and how it worked and that sort of thing. And in a lot of cases, people will have various things around them that they may tie into the Underground Railroad story. But what we found was that as we got into really exploring the story of the Underground Railroad, we found that a lot of the things that people told us about the Underground Railroad were not, in fact, the case. You know, whether it was tunnels or quilts or any number of other sorts of things, or even that parts of the story that were in fact valid parts of the story were conflated in people's minds to be 100% of the story, when in fact it was only a small portion of the story. So as we began our exploration of the Underground Railroad, it was a project that both my wife and I worked on together. We were co-founders of the Underground Railroad Education Center. She was a 5th grade teacher, and she was looking for stories of real people to bring into her classroom. And I was doing social work, community work, and I was looking for more things that I could write about for the newspaper that I was writing for. And so as we began exploring the stories, at first we found that people would tell us things about the Underground Railroad that subsequently proved not to be true, or that, you know, they would pass along information to us, or maybe point to particular sites or locations that said that there was some connection with the Underground Railroad, and maybe that couldn't really be proved. But as time went on, we began to accumulate some stories that were from a variety of different places and written materials and whatnot. and put them together in a walking tour. And the walking tour then led to a conference, and then the conference led to the discovery of a building, which was at 194 Livingston Avenue in Albany. Historically, the location was 198 Lumber Street, but the name of the street had changed after the Civil War. And what I have pictured here is the Stephen and Harriet Myers residence, which at this point is an award-winning historic site. It's on the National Register of Historic Places. It's on the National Network to Freedom of the National Park Service. It's an invited member of the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience. And it's also a member of the Hudson River Valley Greenway and the Erie Canal Heritage Corridor. So, but what you see there is on your left in general, on your left there, the building as we came to it in 2004, and as it is more or less now. There's a picture there from 2016 on the one side, and then on the other side there's a picture from 2022. We were busy in the process of restoring. So our nonprofit organization purchased the building for a whopping $1,500, and we've been working on restoring the building, doing, applying for grants, getting some support from the state of New York, some private grants, and lots of individuals in the community who have stepped forward and contributed toward the restoration of the building, trying to bring the building back to what it looked like in the 1850s and how it was. Now, this building was a site for the Vigilance Committee of the Underground Railroad. In a moment, I'm going to kind of get to kind of a Columbia County related stories, but the Vigilance Committee, the way we found it was because of a document. The document is pictured there. It's called the Vigilance Committee Flyer. The flyer, the original of the flyer is at the Antiquarian Society in Worcester, Massachusetts. And one of the people who we were connecting with had gone to Worcester, Massachusetts, doing some research, saw the flyer. Now, we subsequently learned that that flyer, the information in that flyer, was also reproduced in a couple of abolitionist newspapers that were published, particularly one particular, the Pine and Palm, which was published out of Boston. And the information on the flyer gives not only the address of the Underground Railroad stop, as it were, the headquarters of the Vigilance Committee, but also goes on to talk about the kind of work that they did. Now, just as a footnote here, vigilance committees, there are key elements of the Underground Railroad. If there anything can be called an institution of the Underground Railroad, it's certainly a Vigilance Committee. Around 1835, David Ruggles helped form the first Vigilance Committee in the city of New York. Not very rapidly after that, Vigilance Committees popped up in many northern cities. So there was one in Boston, there was one in Albany, there was one in Syracuse, one in Buffalo, and other cities around the country. There was not one in Hudson, at least not that I know of. So that's something of interest in this regard. But the Vigilance Committees were not just centered on one particular city. So they did have a kind of a regional impact. And so the Vigilance Committee in Albany certainly was important. There was a similar committee in the city of Troy. The cities of Albany and Troy seemed to play off of each other a little bit in terms of the kinds of things that were going on. And of course, there were also lots of links between the two cities in terms of the work that was going on, and as well links into the city of Hudson in Columbia County. Pictured here is a picture of David Ruggles, who was the individual, an interesting fellow who was an activist, Black activist in the city of New York City. He opened a bookstore, he started a magazine, he was very much believed in the intervention, the capacity of people to intervene to prevent people from being either captured and retaken into slavery, or to liberate people from enslavement. So quite an interesting individual, and somebody who people should know something about. So when I talked about what was, this site, the Stephen and Harriet Myers residence, and the fact that it was a document that helped lead us to that site, it brings up a couple of different things that I want to spend some time on. One is what we call our 8 key concepts or key ideas that help us in understanding the Underground Railroad. I think very much so. We don't really, people in general don't give a lot of thought about the Underground Railroad story unless they're really focused on it. And if they do, they have certain ideas in mind, not necessarily even articulated, but ideas which influence how they think about the Underground Railroad. And among the things that have really come and struck us over the years that we have been exploring the story of the Underground Railroad is that you can understand the story as a document-based story. Now, a lot of times people will say and have said that, for this individual or that individual, there are not too many documents that are available, or there are no documents available. In some cases, what people really mean is that there are no repositories at particular universities where they can go and do research there. Or in some other cases, there are very few things that have been left and survived. But nonetheless, there are things that have survived from that period, from the years before the Civil War, the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. And those documents can be extremely important in helping us understand the Underground Railroad. And they can also be extremely important in helping us understand, any of the reform movements from back in those days. The Underground Railroad in particular, this is important for because so often people talk about there being no records or few records or records having been destroyed, some of which were certainly destroyed in the period right around the Civil War or immediately following the Civil War, because people were concerned about being prosecuted in relation to the work that they were doing, which was illegal in terms of helping fugitive slaves. But some people did preserve their records, and those records are available to us to look at and to learn from, and to have those records articulate to us what the story of the Underground Railroad was. Reality versus myth. Once again, all of those ideas that I talked about before that people often have in their minds, the real stories are actually much more interesting than the conflated stories that we have in our imaginations. I often like to think about the stories that we were told when we were kids, like maybe when you went fishing with your father or whatever, and the fish you caught was, probably as big as your finger, but to you, when you were really, really young, it was like huge, and you grew up and you still put your hands in the same way that you met, when you were a kid, but the fish got bigger. So that's kind of a myth making that we sometimes get into. And once again, the real stories that are often articulated to us from these documents are different from that. And that the Underground Railroad is a movement, not a string of safe houses. I know that is often the way in the newspaper when they're trying to break to a quick explanation of what the Underground Railroad is. They'll say a string of safe houses slaves used to escape to freedom in the North and Canada. Now, the Underground Railroad is much more than that. Not only was it, certainly safe houses were involved, but families were in those safe houses and individuals who lived in them. And those places were centers of resources in many cases, where lots of things came together. I think about, in the case of one of the figures here in Albany, Stephen Myers, he wasn't a person who acted alone, but he acted together with others. And this is often the case really across the country, where you do have people who are involved in the Underground Railroad. They have communities of people, communities of support. And also, as part of those communities of support, sometimes there are newspapers that are published. There are songs that are produced and sung at rallies and conventions, etc. So there's a lot more to it. The other element in the story of the Underground Railroad that I think is extremely important is that it was an international movement. And by that, I don't just mean from the United States into Canada, but also in the Southeast, people were escaping into the Caribbean, and in the South, and then also finding refuge in the South sometimes, and then also escaping in the Southwest to Mexico, into the Great Plains. And there are even stories about people who escaped by going overseas, both to Europe and Africa. So the story is a lot more complex than we generally think of it. The role that African Americans played, again, very often, usually people think of the Underground Railroad as a movement of whites helping blacks. It's been portrayed that way in the past, and it isn't that it is not that it isn't that way at all. It's just that African Americans played a leadership role in the Underground Railroad as well. And we're going to certainly focus in on a particular example of that a little bit. That it's a form of civil disobedience and resistance to law, civil disobedience to the established order. The language we use is important in terms of talking about the Underground Railroad. I know for myself, I tend to prefer to use the word freedom seeker rather than escaped slave. You know, what I ask people to do is to think about the point of view from which you are coming at this. You know, is a person, can we talk about them in terms of their motivation, or do we talk about a person who is trapped in enslavement, you know, and who has agency and you know, can assert some independence? The language we use is important. And the connection of these stories from the past to the present is also important, and I think I'll touch on that a little bit later. The other big category of things that I want to put out there for people is to think about is this idea of the Wellman scale. Now, that is to say, Judy Wellman, who was a professor of history, retired from State University at Oswego. She's written a number of books on women's rights and the women's movement, but also on the Underground Railroad. She continues to do a lot of research on the Underground Railroad. And you probably wonder, like, well, why would somebody be doing research on the Underground Railroad? You would think that after 150, 160 years, this story would be figured out. Well, case in point, it is not. And people are still discovering new things today as we move forward in time. A good example of that are the stories that are coming out about the Underground Railroad in the Southwest. Several books have just recently been published about the Underground Railroad in Mexico and in Texas and Mexico. And what they found is that the Mexican police records, when they would stop people and question people who were traveling, they would get very detailed information about where they came from and what their story was. This information has been in Mexican police records and their archives all along, but Americans in general have never gone after them to look for them. And so as a result of that, these stories are only just now coming out because scholars are beginning to pay attention to that now. So in terms of the Wellman scale, there's a lot of debate, or has always been a lot of debate around the issue. Well, when is something when we look at something, you know, how do we know that that's part of the Underground Railroad? And what Judith Wellman did was she kind of created this scale that kind of gives levels of certainty, if you will, to something. So for instance, you know, if you have a house and, you know, you're looking at your house and you see there's some anomaly in your house, a tunnel or a hiding place or something, you know, you got to ask some questions about that. You can't just assume that it's part of the Underground Railroad. Is there a story that really goes, you know, with that? Is there a chance the story is true? Is there any other kind of documentation that will give witness to that? You know, and as you can see in the way that she has represented that in her scale, you're kind of moving up the scale as you move down that list to the point where you have a story that's true or almost certainly true with, you know, conclusive evidence that can help make the case there. So, you know, I oftentimes people will come to me and say, oh, you know, this house or that house is a part of the Underground Railroad. My first question is, when was it built? If it wasn't built well into that period, the 1850s, 40s, 30s, or earlier, then it's definitely not. And if it was built in that period, what do we know about it? What do we know about the people that live there? Don't go by the architecture, because 19th century people loved certain kinds of things. They loved to have tunnels running from the barn to the house and other sorts of things like that. So just because there's something like that there doesn't mean it has anything to do with the Underground Railroad. So at any rate, you can see from the various levels that Judith Wellman is presenting there that there are ways to evaluate a location or a site. The way I like to evaluate locations and sites is to ask first, what does the literature tell us? Is there a story that's documented in a newspaper account or even documented in a memoir where we can go to that place and also we can compare it in terms of the age. Is it in the right time period? Are people living there who were known to be involved in the anti-slavery movement, that sort of thing. So those are some of the things. Now, I think that one of the things that to me is just so amazing is that there are so many places and spaces that are identified in historic documents that we have an opportunity to look at, that we kind of don't need to waste our time on places that are frivolous. So so that's something to keep in mind. Let me see here. I see some chat questions. Okay, so yes, in fact, that was a front and back view of the Myers residence before. Okay, so let's press on here. If I can figure out how to make the advance the slides. So in the years before the Civil War, are we there okay?
Looks like there's a secondary audio that logged in.
Yeah. So in the years before the Civil War, there were lots of different kinds of reform movements. And I would like to draw your attention particularly to a man by the name of Charles Marriott, who lived in the community of Hudson. And Fergus Bordewich, who is a scholar on the Underground Railroad, did some research on Charles Marriott. And one of the things that he identified in that was that Charles Marriott was a key individual in the story. Charles Marriott was a Quaker. He died in 1843. He was a very close friend of Isaac Hopper and Roland Robinson. Now, Isaac Hopper was a man who, back in the 1820s, began doing things that, in a sense, were forerunners, if you will, of the broader Underground Railroad movement. He would go to court and intervene on behalf of fugitive slaves. He would help people directly. He would provide money and resources. And his Quaker community that he was involved with was really kind of disturbed by his level of activism around this. And so he kind of had to leave Philadelphia and move to New York City, where he continued to do the same sort of thing. Roland Robinson was also a Quaker and very active in the anti-slavery work. And the three of them, because of their activities, Roland Robinson, Charles Marriott, and Isaac Hopper, were expelled from their Quaker meeting. There was a belief at the time that you can have the anti-slavery sentiments, but assertively acting by going to court and doing some of the other things that Isaac Hopper was doing was frowned upon. Charles Marriott was known as an active anti-slavery person. He As you can see in the quote there, he has connections in a number of other states. So in the the 1830s or so, early 1840s, he was a significant player in terms of assisting people. Now, one of the things that has often been important about the Underground Railroad story is that it changed over time. That is to say, in the 1820s and early 1840s, when Charles Marriott was active and many others were active, there were many people traveling overland to get to their freedom, to make their way up into perhaps the capital region and then on into Vermont and on to Canada, or to connect into the Erie Canal and go west. But as technology changed, the Underground Railroad changed. And so as we moved well into the 1840s, people tended to stop using overland routes. And when traveling from New York City to Albany and Troy, they would actually use the available steamboats and sailboats that were there. As the technology improved, people, the amount of time that it took you to get from New York City to Albany reduced from 2 weeks or 10 days to 7 hours. So you can see it was a lot more convenient for people to purchase tickets on one of the dayliners that was traveling between New York City and the upstate region than it was to have people go across land where there was greater opportunity, greater risk of capture, greater risk of difficulty, and where more money and people's time investment was involved in that transportation. And as a result of that, we went through a period probably in the 1850s when there were very few people that were turning up in some places like Greene County and Columbia County who were in transit on their way to freedom somewhere else in the North in Canada. And that was the case because of the ease with which transportation was being had on the Hudson River in particular. So people who escaped from the South and maybe, got to Philadelphia and then went on from Philadelphia to New York City, found then that they could just board a steamboat in New York City and get to Albany within a day. And so, a person who was boarding a steamboat down there could count on getting to Canada probably within a week or so with the speed of that transportation. Some of the reform movements overlap with each other, and this is the case for both temperance and, of course, some of the other movements that were going on. What's shown here is a newspaper clip from Frederick Douglass's paper in 1852 with a note about the free democracy movement that was happening across the state. Part of the point of the free democracy movement was to secure the right to vote for Black men in New York State and to make the democracy a place of freedom rather than a place supported by slavery. And so again, this is part of the anti-slavery movement, but part of the general rights movement for African people, African Americans. And as you can see, quite interestingly here, Stephen Myers of Albany, the editor of the Telegraph and Temperance Journal, is elected as the state representative for the first assembly of the free democracy movement. So this is, one of the things that I found was quite interesting is the interrelationship between Albany and Hudson in particular, particularly with the work of Stephen Myers. Stephen Myers is pictured there. So just a few other notes on Stephen Myers. So Stephen Myers was born in what we call Rensselaer County today. I think that it actually was born at a time when the county had just recently been organized. Some documents say that he got his freedom at the age of 18. We've said that as 1818, but because of the ambiguity about the date at which Stephen was actually born, it might have been even a little earlier than that. Some other documents say he got his freedom under the General Emancipation in New York State, which would suggest 1827. But regardless, somewhere in there, he did get his freedom. He worked a variety of different things. He was active in the anti-slavery work as early as the 1830s. There was a minister in Albany by the name of Nathaniel Call, who led a group called the Clarkson Anti-Slavery Society. Seems to be a local group that was organized and based through his church, but a number of other people were clearly members as well. And in our city directories, we see that Stephen Myers was in fact a member of that group as well. So Stephen Myers seemed to have a great interest in the use of newspapers. After 1827, there had been some changes in technology that allowed newspapers to be published more easily. And so newspapers popped up literally all over the country in ways that they hadn't before. And Stephen Myers took advantage of this technology and the ease with which papers were being produced to produce an anti-slavery paper. He published one called The Elevator in the 1830s. And then it's known that he went on to publish another paper called The Northern Star and Freeman's Advocate. I've read various accounts that suggest different sorts of things, but we do know that in the late 1840s, he changed the name of the newspaper to the Northern Star and Colored Farmer because he was part of a movement to try to get free people of color, Black people to move out into the countryside and to establish themselves as farmers as a way for them to be independent and self-sufficient. He was also in the late 1840s and into the 1850s an agent for the Vigilance Committee of the Underground Railroad operating out of Albany. He was also active in the temperance movement and the voting rights movement. In the late 1850s, he was involved with a statewide effort to get the right to vote for Black men. And so there were actually suffrage clubs, voting rights clubs around the state that gathered signatures that brought them to the state legislature to ask the state legislature to provide to do a referendum to put before the public and the voting public whether or not Black men could vote in New York State. Unfortunately, that referendum did not pass. And so Black men in New York State and Blacks in general had to wait till after the Civil War when the voting rights amendments were passed, the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. He was active in temperance and voting rights. He was in the 1840s a part of something called the Delavan Temperance Union, which was an organization organized by Edwin C. Delavan to further the idea of temperance. I think even in the 1840s and 50s, people recognized the role that spirits, alcohol, strong drink played in terms of tearing families apart and physical violence and other sorts of things. And so there was one element of the temperance movement that they called themselves the Cold Water Army, to prefer to drink water rather than to drink strong spirits. So now the temperance movement, one of the things that I wanted to make as a point here is that the temperance movement was really showed itself with a lot of rallies and public demonstrations. And there were people from Albany who went to a major rally that happened in Hudson. I believe it was in the 1840s. And so I was trying to track down some newspaper clippings about that. I was not able to, but I thought it was interesting because Stephen Myers, as I remember it, was getting on a boat with numerous other people. They were going to Hudson for this temperance rally. So something of interest there. So kind of bringing my presentation to a conclusion, we do find there's a lot of cross activity between Albany and Hudson in Columbia County. There's probably a lot more that we could talk about, but for various reasons, I'm going to kind of bring it to a close there, and I'm going to ask if people have any questions or observations. I'm not sure if we have any, if our other library people there. Do we have any? We don't see any questions in the
Yeah.
chat.
I don't see anything in the chat. What are the questions? Oh, here we go. How often are tours conducted?
All right. How often are tours conducted? Well, we do. We have done walking tours by request, though we don't do them much nowadays because it's a lot easier to do tours of the Myers residence. So we generally do them throughout the week. You know, we try to schedule them to the extent that we can. And so that means that sometimes, like for instance, this past Saturday, we had 2 groups. So we had one at 1, and then we had another one at 4:30. So the tours generally take about an hour and a half. And I think people really would have a good solid introduction both to the Underground Railroad and some of the things that are happening in our region by taking the tour.
Thanks. And just to let everybody know, remember that the Columbia County Libraries have a museum pass program, and the Underground Railroad is one of those sites where you can go on any of the library's websites and look up the museum passes and borrow one of those for free. There's a few more questions here. Let's see.
I do see, yeah, another question there. You know, what future research are we planning to engage in? And you know, the research in this story is kind of ongoing. There are new things coming out all the time. We certainly will be spending more time exploring the you know, the Underground Railroad in the Southwest and the Caribbean. Those are 2 areas that I think are, you know, hot in research right now. We'll also be spending more time exploring things. You know, one of the things that I thought was really, really interesting in you know, as I was preparing for this presentation is it's really difficult to find good information on the internet. You know, there is some out there, but you know, for some of the twists and turns of the Underground Railroad and the abolition movement and temperance movement in New York State, the information is not really effectively there. You know, and I was you know, really quite surprised. There are many things that we've, you know, kind of come across over the years that have, you know, kind of led us in different directions. Usually it's information coming from, you know, 19th century newspapers, et cetera, and details about specific things. But the internet is not that good at delivering information. You'd think it would be because of the ease with which you can find documents and things, and some things there are. But, you know, for instance, you know, getting lots of detailed information about, you know, for instance, just as an example, I was looking for a picture of Charles Marriott's house in Hudson. And, you know, I'll be darned if I could identify, you know, you put in Charles Marriott and Hudson, New York, and you get lots of New York listings, New York City, and of course Marriott hotels, which is not what you're looking for. So some of the people who were in the early stages of the abolition movement and were deeply connected with the Underground Railroad, like Abel Brown and Charles Marriott, often seem to get buried in the process there. let's see, what else? Stephen Myers was born in Rensselaer County. Oh, well, yeah, when there's a question here. Well, I want to come back to that research question because I think it's safe to say we're kind of pressing ahead on a number of fronts all the time. And so that's just the challenge. There's a question about Stephen Myers, born in Rensselaer County, but was not freed until 1818. Was he born a slave in New York? He was born into enslavement in New York. He was enslaved in the Yates family, which was a prominent family in Albany. That's a whole nother area of great research that we're looking into. Just try to learn more about that. Here's another question. The New York State Education Department has very old newspapers in the stacks in the main building. Yep, good place to hunt for resources. Is Charles Marriott related to the founder of the Marriott Hotels? You know what? I don't know. I kind of don't think so. I mean, my experience of the Marriott Hotels is that it's somewhat of a family business. Many people in the upper echelons of the Marriott hotels are of the same family, the Marriott family. But it doesn't seem to be, Charles Marriott was a Quaker, and many of the Marriotts are Mormons. So I know people change, but it sort of seems like a different line of family history there. Other
Toby,
thoughts?
it looks like we have several questions in the Q&A as well.
All right, let me see. All right, maybe
Actually, that one that just popped up in the chat is repeated in the Q&A about were women involved too. Maybe if you want to
yes.
snag
Yeah,
that one
that's-
first.
That is a huge thing, and in terms of balance, I apologize for not presenting that there. When we talk about Stephen Myers, for instance, even with the building there, we talk the Stephen and Harriet Myers residence, and we do that because we recognize that Harriet Myers was hugely involved in what was happening. It wasn't like she was off, minding the kids by herself, that sort of thing. But she was involved in doing editorial work on the newspapers. There's a very wonderful letter that she wrote to William John Jay that was preserved in the Jay family papers about that kind of documents her involvement with the Underground Railroad. Although it's in 1860, it's certainly a witness to the fact that she had been doing that kind of work since the 1830s. And I think that you certainly could go around and look at so many other places and spaces and folks that were involved in the Underground Railroad. I'd be willing to bet, although it is not presented in the material that I read, that Charles Marriott's wife was deeply involved in the Underground Railroad too. So yeah, absolutely. If there are other questions there's questions in the chat and questions in the Q&A, and I don't think I can access the Q&A here.
Okay,
Sure,
so
I have oh, go ahead, Toby.
okay, I was gonna say, one was what are some of the other Underground Railroad sites in the region?
Underground Railroad sites are an interesting sort of phenomenon. There are a number of places that I would say are tied into the story of the Underground Railroad. For instance, in the city of Troy, the First Presbyterian Church, the site of the First Presbyterian Church that was there is now Bush Auditorium for Russell Sage College. The U.S. Commissioner's Office, which although not being an Underground Railroad stop, is certainly considered to be something that would be noted on an Underground Railroad trail. So the Commissioner's Office, where the commissioner who oversaw the fugitive slave law cases on State Street in the city of Troy. The building is still there. Fundamentally the office is still there, but it's a private space now. So it's not something that people can go into, but there is a plaque there that identifies the place. A lot of other places that are tied into the Underground Railroad story, the buildings have burned or been torn down or otherwise replaced. For instance, in downtown Albany, we used to do a walking tour there. And there's a place where Lydia and Abigail Mott, who were cited as ladies well known to the Underground Railroad friends, anti-slavery friends in Boston and elsewhere. The place where their store was is converted to another building, into something else. Another place where they had a boarding house. Another building has replaced whatever was there. As you do find that a lot. But that doesn't mean those places, those locations can't be marked and stories told, which is what we have tried to do in the past. So, other things there?
One says railroads were not common before the 1820s. Do we know what the movement was called before the Underground Railroad?
Sure. So probably in the 1820s, though definitely in the 1830s, people call it the Underground Road. And it was the Underground Road ambiguously into the 1840s. So in the 1840s, you have people like Abel Brown, who didn't call it the Underground Railroad or whatever, they call it the shipping business. You know, they would sometimes use language that was coded when they were sending correspondence between their sites across the country, talking about shipping hard goods and soft goods. So those are men and women, big packages and little packages, older people and younger people. But that was not necessarily universal in terms of communications that were given. Even more cryptic stuff sometimes was done. It's in a letter in William Still's book, The Underground Railroad, where a person who received help from William Still came to Albany and wrote a letter back saying thank you. That letter is published in the book. And he makes a very cryptic reference to some biblical passages in order to communicate what he's trying to get across. And I think, whoever received the letter knew what he was saying, but it wasn't all that clear just reading the letter. Yeah. So as you get into the 1840s, then it begins to be called the Underground Railroad. And into the 1850s as well, when people actually, in some cases, in the late 1850s, using railroads. And it's identified as the Underground Railroad because it's secret and fast. Underground being secret, railroad being fast. Yeah, so.
There's a whole bunch here. So I think you answered. Somebody asked where Myers came from. You already gave that information. Someone asked if you know, where did it go? What the address was in Hudson for Mr. Myers.
I don't, and I'm hot on the trail.
Have you ever come upon mentions of movements of enslaved people in New York in the early 1800s to neighboring states like Massachusetts or Connecticut, when slavery existed in New York but abolished in those states?
By and large, in written material that I've encountered, I have not specifically seen that. However, much of the work, say, as you move into out of the 18 teens into the 1820s and 30s, things start to develop all over the country in different ways. And there are movements after like 1830. There had developed this thing which generally is called the convention movement. So Blacks would organize conventions, and in those conventions they would hammer out issue papers about different issues regarding education and work and opportunities for young people and the abolition of slavery and voting rights. In many cases, they would develop agendas that they would then take to state politicians. So even though they didn't have the right to vote, they still pressed their case as people deserving of having these kinds of things for them as they were part of the American scene and the American community. So, and that just snowballed as we went forward. Whether it was voting rights work, as was illustrated before, or whether it was, these conventions. And you can find, if you just Google, African American Convention movement, you can find there's a website that has many of those documents on the website, so you can actually read them. And I think it's a real eye-opener in terms of the political efforts that were taking place at that time.
Great, thanks. There's just a few more things here. Let's see. Can you identify other buildings in Hudson?
My suspicion is that is another horizon that we can work on. So certainly Charles Marriott's home is one, but it is highly likely that there's a community of people that he worked with in and around Hudson, and so all of them are suspects. So
another is there were connections between the abolition movement and the women's suffrage movement. Any evidence of that in the Capital Region?
Well, a lot of the people who worked on abolition in the late 1850s also worked on women's suffrage. And as a matter of fact, there were a number of Black women that we've been able to identify in literature that were actually voting in the 1850s in regional and local elections. It's just that they didn't have the right to vote in national elections. And so, this is something that I suspect, we looked at in the Capital Region, and I suspect it may very well have happened in other places as well. But usually when the bigwigs tell the history, they usually don't think to mention that. But it's there.
I think we have two questions left. What are examples of popular myths? And then who is Minos McGowan?
Okay, so some examples of popular myths, certainly quilts. Back in 1998 or so, the nation was swept by storm by a book called Hidden in Plain View. And the book claimed to make the case that there was a secret code in the quilts, and that this secret code was used to enable people to escape. And I think people kind of like made a connection in their mind that everybody was using a quilt code. The fundamental error of the idea, besides the fact that no first-person narrative of anyone who escaped ever mentioned a quilt or a quilt code. They spilled the beans on all kinds of other things, though. I like to, Frederick Douglass's narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. In there, he talks about how he escaped, how he borrowed another person's pass, how he dressed up as a sailor because sailors were treated differently, and then walked to a ferry boat, got on a ferry boat, went away. And at another point, it talks about he and some of his fellow folks who were enslaved would go out into the woods in what some people call a hush harbor, or a protected space where they could be away from the enslaver, and they would pray and fellowship together there. Two things that I think maybe he didn't necessarily, if I were making a choice, I wouldn't put them in my bestseller. So this was always a controversy for the folks in the anti-slavery movement. How much to tell, how much to put out there. we found some newspaper clippings in a lot of newspapers here in the region about meetings of the Underground Railroad, and they're in the paper as meetings of the Underground Railroad. And then they talk about who's going to be at the meeting, and what kind of business they're going to conduct at the meeting, as a stockholders meeting, whatever. Sometimes they played with that language. Minus McGowan was a lumber merchant in North Pearl Street. He was a member of the Vigilance Committee in the mid 1850s. We don't know a lot about him, but he was an Albany resident and a person that was active in the region.
I believe the last question I have on here is, are there reliable numbers? I'm not sure as to what numbers he's referring to.
Well, the numbers that people always talk about is like how many people, pass through the region, that sort of thing. We've got, we were able to identify something in the neighborhood of 130, 135 stories of individuals where we have the name, we have a little bit of information about where they came from, where they were going, that sort of thing. The Vigilance Committee flyer in 1856 says that in a 10-month period, actually the flyer is in 1857, at any rate, in a 10-month period across that time, 287 people passed through Albany. The 1842 Vigilance Committee annual report says that 350 people were helped in that year by the Vigilance Committee. It would be wrong to do this, but I mean, you could take those two numbers and say, well, across 15 years, just multiply, average 300 people. That wouldn't be right because the numbers went up and down. But you could easily see that we're talking thousands of people, really.
There aren't any questions. There's two comments left. That was a nice article in the yesterday's Times-Union, and the time perfectly for this presentation. And then someone else had put in, and it looks like it's gone now. They were saying that there's a program coming up with the Columbia County Historical Society on the 26th, and I asked them to put it in the chat if anybody wanted to know how to register for that, but I haven't seen that.
Yeah,
So if anybody's interested in that, you can look for it through
I had seen that
Society.
announced.
I just found it in the answered questions. I'll put it over into the chat so people could
Okay.
see it.
Yeah.
Great.
Yep.
Thanks.
So there's a lot of additional research that can be done, and I also think that some of the ins and outs of the story, broadly speaking, like the changes from like the Liberty Party and the Free Soil Party and the Republican Party, etc. That in many cases there's not enough detail in some of the things that are out there on the web, and so that's something that I think that we need to take a look at and see if we can change that.
Well, excellent. Thank
Well,
you very much, Paul, for joining us tonight.
Thank you
This is
very much.
everybody's last chance to ask the question.
Yeah. And so if people are interested in exploring this story further, they might visit our website at undergroundrailroadhistory.org. There's a number of newsletter articles that are posted on that website, as well as other articles that I think people will find really, really interesting. And they can also keep up with the different program activities that Underground Railroad Education Center is engaged in. In reference to the article that was in the paper just this weekend, we are looking forward to, we're doing planning right now for the development of an interpretive center. We have several lots that we're able to build on. And we're in the process of organizing resources in order to create that interpretive center, which we'll look forward to having in the future. So come visit us. 194 Livingston Avenue in Albany, 518-621-7793, and undergroundrailroadhistory.org. You can find oh, I forgot what I was going to say, but you can go to the website, you can schedule your visit through the website. I do see a note here in the chat mentioning Massachusetts, and I think it's worth noting that Northampton, Massachusetts, David Ruggles ultimately wound up in Northampton, Massachusetts, and he was doing a health program there called the Cold Water Cure. And lots of people come there. And as a matter of fact, there's a group in Northampton that celebrates his story. And also Reverend Harrison, who was the chaplain for the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, had his home in Pittsfield. So that's another place that you can take a look at and visit. And then also W.E.B. Du Bois. Of course, this doesn't have anything to do with the Underground Railroad, but just kind of in the same vein somewhat, was born in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. And the site of his boyhood home is there. And there's also a Du Bois Center there as well. So there's some other things you can look at regionally. And if you really want to go far, you certainly can go to John Brown's farm up in Elba. And there are other things around the region too. So thank you.
Excellent. All right. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and happy searching. All right. Good night.
Good night.